I am not livestock. The words left Lena Bennett's mouth sharp and clear, even as her heart slammed against her ribs like a prisoner against bars. Across the torch-lit throne room, vast, cold, carved from black stone that drank the light, King Marcellus Velaryth finally lifted his gaze from the parchment in his pale hands. The firelight turned his eyes into something inhuman and eternal. Your mother already signed the contract, girl. His voice was dangerously quiet, each word wrapped in centuries of authority, made even simple declarations sound like executions. I'm simply collecting what was promised, which is you. Lena's nails bit into her palms, grounding her against the urge to scream, run, or collapse. A blood debt. That's what her mother had traded for. That's what Diane Bennett had gambled with. Lena's freedom, her future, her very veins, to buy her brother one more year of life. And now she stood in this ancient fortress, somewhere in the dark heart of the Carpathian Mountains, surrounded by armoured guards with fangs beneath their lips, like cargo waiting to be claimed. Then you're going to be disappointed, Lena said, lifting her chin, because I don't kneel to anyone. Marcellus Velaryth's lips didn't quite smile. The expression was colder than that, sharper, like a fang testing skin before it breaks through. You have two choices, Miss Bennett. He leaned forward slightly, utterly in control, eyes glowing faintly in the dim hall. Repay the debt in gold you do not possess. He paused. Or repay it in blood, as mine. Lena had been halfway through her apprenticeship with Master Aldrich, the court physician, when the rider came. Black horse, black cloak, sealed letter bearing a crimson seal. She almost refused it. She was 3 hours into grinding medicinal herbs for the winter stores, her hands already stained with foxglove and nightshade. But something cold crept down her spine, something that whispered, "Open it." The letter was written in elegant script, each word precise as a blade. Miss Bennett, this is regarding a blood contract registered under your family name with the Midnight Court. The world stopped. The mortar slipped from her fingers and shattered on the stone floor. Your mother, Diane of House Bennett, signed an accord with His Majesty King Marcellus Velaryth. Payment is now due. The ink seemed to pulse in the candlelight. You have 48 hours to settle the contract, or present yourself to the royal treasury at Velaryth Keep. No signature, just the royal seal pressed in wax the colour of dried blood. Lena sat frozen in that apothecary, the letter trembling in her hands, her mind fracturing. Diane, the woman who'd vanished 2 winters ago, the woman who resurfaced only when Declan's lungs were failing, when the physicians had given up hope. She'd sold Lena to save her son. Lena tried to find her mother for 2 days straight, rode to the cottage outside the village, questioned the herbalist Rosamond who'd last seen her, searched the forest paths Diane used to walk. By the time the second sunset bled across the sky, Lena had learned the truth from Father Clement at the village chapel. Diane Bennett had died 4 days prior. Fever, sudden, violent, vanished like smoke, leaving her daughter to pay for her desperation in ways that turned Lena's blood to ice. They came for her at midnight, 4 riders in black armour, torches blazing against the autumn dark, too silent to be mortal, too graceful to be anything else. They didn't threaten, didn't need to. The captain, a tall, pale figure with eyes like winter frost, handed her a sealed summons bearing the Velaryth crest and told her to be ready by dawn. King Marcellus does not wait, and he does not forgive tardiness. His smile didn't reach his eyes. He is a merciful sovereign when debts are honoured. Lena knew that name. Everyone from the villages of Wallachia to the courts of Vienna knew Marcellus Velaryth, the Immortal, the Blood King, the sovereign who had ruled the Midnight Court for 3 centuries with absolute, terrifying control. People who defied him didn't get warnings. They disappeared, and their families learned not to ask questions. She should have run, should have grabbed Declan, stolen a horse, and fled across the border into Transylvania or beyond. But running meant her brother, frail, asthmatic, dreaming of becoming a scribe, would become a target. Running meant Master Aldrich, the physician who'd taken her in as an orphan, would face the king's wrath. Her mother had made sure this debt touched everyone she loved, made sure she was trapped. So the next morning, at dawn, wearing her only good cloak and carrying a heart full of rage and terror, Lena Bennett rode toward Velaryth Keep. The Velaryth fortress didn't look like a dungeon. It looked like power, stone towers piercing the mist, iron gates that groaned like dying men, battlements older than memory, stained with centuries of blood. The kind of place where kings were crowned and traitors were buried in the same hall. She was escorted through a vaulted corridor by a guard who moved like a wolf in armour, past tapestries depicting ancient battles and slaughtered armies, up a spiral staircase that led to the throne room, where the air itself felt heavier, colder, laced with old magic. The chamber she entered was all black marble and iron chandeliers, torchlight flickering against stained glass windows that depicted centuries of conquest. And there, on a throne carved from obsidian, sat Marcellus Velaryth. He was younger than she'd imagined, maybe 30 in appearance, but his eyes were ancient, sharp, calculating, the kind of eyes that had watched empires fall and hadn't blinked. His jet black hair fell just past his jaw, tied loosely with a silver cord. His midnight doublet was embroidered with crimson thread, roses, and thorns intertwined, cut so precisely it looked like war and seduction, stitched into velvet, pale hands, long fingers, rings that glinted with rubies dark as arterial blood. And when he looked at her, Lena felt the air leave her lungs, not from fear, from the weight of his attention, like being seen by something that could unmake you with a word. "Kneel," he said. His voice was velvet and venom. "You belong to me now." Lena didn't move, didn't blink, didn't kneel. "No," she said, and the entire room held its breath. "Kneel," he said again. His voice was velvet and venom, soft enough to be a lover's whisper, cold enough to freeze marrow. Lena's knees trembled. Her body screamed at her to obey, to collapse, to make herself small before this creature who sat on a throne of bone and shadow like he'd been carved from the same stone. But her spine locked, her chin lifted, and the word that left her mouth tasted like rebellion and ruin. No. The silence that followed was deafening. Somewhere in the rafters, a torch guttered and died. The guards along the walls shifted, hands moving toward weapons they hadn't needed to draw in decades. And King Marcellus Velaryth, sovereign of the Midnight Court, ruler of blood and darkness for 300 years, did something Lena did not expect. He smiled. Not warmly, not kindly, like a wolf that had just discovered its prey had teeth. "Say that again," he murmured, rising from his throne with the fluid grace of something that had forgotten what it meant to be human. He descended the dais steps slowly, boots silent against black marble, eyes never leaving hers. "I want to hear you refuse me one more time before I decide what to do with you." Lena's heart hammered so violently she was certain he could hear it. Vampires could hear heartbeats, couldn't they? Could smell fear like hounds, scenting blood. Her palms were slick with sweat, but she curled her fingers into fists and held her ground, even as he crossed the distance between them, even as the air itself seemed to thicken with the weight of his presence. "I said no," she repeated, and her voice cracked only once. "I didn't sign your contract. My mother had no right to sell me, and I will not kneel to you or anyone else in this God-forsaken place." He stopped 3 feet away, close enough that she could see the inhuman stillness of his chest, the way he didn't breathe unless he chose to. Close enough to see the fine embroidery on his doublet, crimson roses stitched so intricately they looked wet in the torchlight. Close enough to smell him, cold stone and something darker, older, like earth turned over in a graveyard. "God-forsaken," Marcellus repeated, tasting the word like wine. "Yes, God abandoned this place centuries ago, girl. But I did not." He tilted his head, studying her the way a scholar might study a manuscript written in a language he'd forgotten. "Your mother came to me 2 winters past, begged on her knees in this very hall. Her son was dying. Physicians had given up. Priests had prayed and received no answer." His eyes glowed faintly, embers in the dark. "I gave her what your God would not, a vial of my blood, enough to heal the boy's lungs, to give him years he would not have lived." Lena's breath caught. Declan, her baby brother who'd stopped wheezing in his sleep, who'd grown stronger, who'd survived the winter that should have killed him. "The price," Marcellus continued, circling her now like a predator, "was her eldest child's blood, a tithe, sustainable, reasonable." He stopped behind her and she felt his presence like a blade pressed to her spine. "But your mother is dead, and debts do not die with the debtor." "Then take my blood," Lena said, voice shaking but steady. "Bleed me. But don't ask me to kneel. Don't ask me to call you master." He laughed, low and dark and utterly without humour. Then his hand closed around her wrist, faster than sight, and he pulled her arm up between them. His thumb pressed against the inside of her wrist, where her pulse hammered wild and desperate. "You misunderstand," he whispered against her ear. "I don't need you to kneel, Lena Bennett. I need you to survive, because your blood—" His lips brushed her skin, and she felt the sharp edge of fangs. "Is worth far more than gold." They gave her a room in the east tower, not a cell, though it might as well have been. High stone walls, a narrow window with iron bars, a bed draped in velvet the colour of dried blood. A silver pitcher of water sat on a carved wooden table beside a bowl of fruit, apples and pears that looked too perfect, too red, like they'd been plucked from a painting instead of an orchard. Lena didn't touch any of it. She paced the room like a caged animal, counting steps, measuring the distance between the door and the window, calculating escapes she knew were impossible. The door was locked from the outside. The window overlooked a sheer drop into a courtyard 3 stories below, where armoured guards patrolled in perfect silence. And even if she survived the fall, even if she somehow slipped past the guards, the forest beyond the castle walls was darker than any she'd ever seen, twisted and thick with mist that seemed to breathe. She was trapped, owned, a piece of collateral in a contract she'd never signed. The rage that filled her chest was so vast she could barely breathe around it. Her mother had done this. Diane, who'd abandoned them, who'd returned only when desperation clawed at her throat, who'd traded Lena's future for Declan's survival without asking, without warning, without giving her a choice. And now Diane was dead, and Lena was alone in a castle full of monsters, wearing her mother's sins like shackles. A knock at the door made her spin around. She hadn't heard footsteps, hadn't heard anything but her own heartbeat and the distant howl of wind through the battlements. "Miss Bennett?" The voice was female, crisp, efficient. "His Majesty requests your presence in the great hall." Lena didn't answer, didn't move. The door opened anyway. A woman stepped inside, tall and pale, with silver blonde hair pulled into a severe knot at the base of her skull. She wore a high-collared gown of midnight blue, elegant and practical, and her eyes were the same unnatural amber as the guard's. Vampire. But her expression was unreadable, neither cruel nor kind. "I am Lady Isolde," the woman said, inclining her head slightly. "Chamberlain of the Midnight Court. You will accompany me to dinner." "I'm not hungry," Lena said flatly. Lady Isolde's lips twitched, almost a smile. "That was not a request. And if I refuse?" "Then the guards will carry you." Isolde's tone didn't change, still polite, still measured. "His Majesty does not appreciate tardiness, nor does he appreciate theatrics. You may walk with dignity, or you may be dragged. The outcome is the same." Lena's jaw tightened. She wanted to scream, to throw the silver pitcher at this woman's perfect face, to rage against the injustice of it all. But she'd learned long ago that anger without strategy was just noise. So she straightened her spine, smoothed her skirts, and met Isolde's gaze with all the defiance she could summon. "Lead the way." The great hall was a cathedral of shadows. Vaulted ceilings disappeared into darkness. Chandeliers hung from iron chains, candles flickering like dying stars. A long table stretched down the centre of the room, polished black wood set with silver plates and crystal goblets that caught the light like shattered ice. And at the head of the table, seated in a high-backed chair that might as well have been a throne, was Marcellus. He didn't look up when she entered, didn't acknowledge her at all. He was reading something, a letter perhaps, his long fingers tracing the parchment with absent focus. But Lena knew he was aware of her, could feel the weight of his attention even when his eyes were elsewhere. "Sit," he said without glancing up. Lena didn't move. Marcellus sighed, a sound of infinite patience wearing thin, and finally looked at her. His expression was unreadable. "You have two options, Miss Bennett. Sit and eat like a civilized guest, or stand there and starve like a stubborn child." He set the letter aside and folded his hands. "Either way, we are going to have a conversation about what happens next." "What happens next," Lena said slowly, "is you let me go." His smile was all teeth. "No." Lena sat. Not because he commanded it, but because her legs were shaking, and she refused to let him see her collapse. She pulled out the chair opposite him with more force than necessary, the legs scraping against stone loud enough to echo through the cavernous hall. His eyes tracked the movement, but his expression didn't change, still that infuriating calm, like he had all the time in the world, and she was simply an entertaining disruption to his evening. A servant appeared from the shadows, silent as smoke, and placed a plate before her. Roasted meat, root vegetables glazed with honey, bread still steaming from the oven. The smell made her stomach clench with hunger she'd been ignoring for 2 days. She didn't touch it. "You need to eat," Marcellus said, lifting his own goblet. The liquid inside was too dark to be wine. "Humans are remarkably fragile when deprived of sustenance. I'd rather starve than accept anything from you." "Dramatic," he murmured almost to himself, "but ultimately pointless." He set the goblet down and leaned back in his chair, studying her with that unnerving intensity that made her feel like a specimen pinned under glass. "Tell me, Miss Bennett, what did you think would happen when you rode through my gates? That I would hear your passionate refusal and simply release you? That nobility and defiance would move a creature who has lived 3 centuries. "I thought," Lena said, voice tight, "that even monsters understand the concept of justice." His laugh was short and sharp, devoid of humour. "Justice?" He repeated the word like it was foreign. "Your mother signed a contract in blood. She invoked ancient law, older than your churches, older than your kings. She received what she asked for. Her son lives because I willed it, and now the debt comes due." He leaned forward, elbows on the table, eyes catching the candlelight until they glowed like embers. "Where is the injustice in that? She had no right to sell me. She had every right. She was your mother. You were hers to bargain with. I am not property." The words tore from her throat louder than she intended, echoing off stone and shadow. The servant near the wall flinched. But Marcellus didn't move, didn't react except for the slight narrowing of his eyes. "No," he said softly, dangerously. "You are not property. You are a debt, and there is a difference." He rose from his chair with that inhuman grace and walked around the table toward her. Lena's instinct screamed at her to run, but there was nowhere to go, no escape, only him and the darkness pressing in from all sides. He stopped beside her chair, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. Property can be discarded, sold, destroyed, but a debt... His hand moved to her shoulder, not gripping, just resting there with a weight that felt like iron. "A debt must be honoured." "Then bleed me and be done with it," Lena spat. "Take what you're owed and let me go home to my brother." Something flickered across his face then, too fast to name. Surprise, maybe, or curiosity. His hand lifted from her shoulder and he stepped back, putting space between them that somehow felt more dangerous than his proximity. "I could," he said slowly, "drain you here and now. Your blood would sustain me for months, but then the debt would be paid and you would be dead, and I would have wasted something far more valuable than a meal." He returned to his seat, movements deliberate, controlled. "Your blood is rare, Lena Bennett. I tasted it the moment you entered my hall, could smell it beneath your skin. It carries something old, something I have not encountered in a century." Her breath caught. "What are you talking about?" "Magic," he said simply. "Your bloodline carries magic. Dormant, perhaps. Forgotten. But present." He picked up his goblet again, swirling the dark liquid inside. "And that makes you far too valuable to kill." "So what then?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "You keep me here forever?" His smile was cold and beautiful and terrible. "Yes." Lena didn't sleep that night. She lay on the velvet bed, staring at the ceiling where shadows danced in the candlelight, her mind racing through possibilities that all ended the same way. Trapped, owned, a living reservoir for a creature who spoke of her blood like it was wine to be savoured. Magic, he'd said. Her bloodline carried magic. The words made no sense. She was a physician's apprentice, daughter of a desperate woman and a father she'd never known. There was nothing special about her except stubbornness and the ability to grind medicinal herbs without falling asleep. But he'd been certain, and vampires didn't lie about things they wanted. When dawn broke grey and cold through the barred window, Lena was already awake, already dressed, already planning. If she couldn't escape, she would learn. Learn the castle, its rhythms, its weaknesses. Learn who held power and who resented it. Learn everything she could about the monster who claimed to own her until she found a way to break free. Lady Isolde arrived with breakfast, another tray of perfect food that Lena forced herself to eat this time because starving wouldn't help Declan and spite was a luxury she couldn't afford. The Chamberlain watched her with those unreadable amber eyes, patient as stone. "His Majesty has instructed me to show you the castle," Isolde said when Lena finished. "You are permitted access to most areas, the library, the gardens, the east wing corridors." She paused. "The dungeons, the blood vaults, and the king's private chambers are forbidden, Violate these boundaries, and the consequences will be severe. How generous, Lena said flatly. A cage with a view. Isolde's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes, almost approval. Follow me. The castle was larger than Lena had imagined, a sprawling fortress of interconnected towers and halls that seemed to exist in perpetual twilight. Torches burned in iron sconces, but they did little to push back the darkness that clung to corners and doorways like living things. Servants moved through the corridors, pale and silent, some human, some clearly not. They didn't meet her eyes, didn't acknowledge her existence except to step aside when she passed. "How many people live here?" Lena asked as they descended a spiral staircase into what Isolde called the lower ward. 237, Isolde replied, without hesitation. 63 vampires of the royal court, 112 human servants, 48 guards, 14 bloodsworn. Bloodsworn? Humans who have pledged service in exchange for protection or favour. Isolde glanced back at her. They are not cattle, Miss Bennett. They are here by choice. Choice, Lena repeated bitterly. What kind of choice is it when the alternative is death? Isolde stopped walking, turned to face her fully. For the first time since they'd met, her mask of cold professionalism cracked. The kind of choice I made 20 years ago when raiders burned my village and slaughtered my family. The king offered me safety, purpose, a life that would have meaning beyond survival. Her voice was quiet, but edged with something sharp. Do not presume to understand what drives people to these halls, girl. You know nothing of this world yet. Before Lena could respond, a sound echoed through the corridor, shouting, the clash of steel on steel. Isolde's head snapped toward the noise, body tensing. "Stay here!" she commanded, and vanished down the hall with inhuman speed. Lena didn't stay. She ran after her, following the sound of chaos to a massive courtyard where a crowd had gathered. In the centre, 2 figures fought with brutal efficiency. One was a vampire, tall and armoured, moving with that terrible grace they all possessed. The other was human, younger, desperate, bleeding from a cut across his cheek, but still fighting. And standing at the edge of the courtyard, arms crossed, watching with clinical detachment, was Marcellus. The human fighter stumbled. The vampire's blade found his throat, and Lena heard herself scream, "Stop!" before she could think better of it. Every head turned toward her, including the king's. His eyes found hers across the distance, and his expression was unreadable. Then he raised one hand. "Hold," he said. The vampire froze. The human collapsed to his knees, gasping, and Marcellus smiled. Marcellus crossed the courtyard with measured steps, boots silent on blood-stained stone, his gaze never leaving Lena's face. The crowd parted for him like water around a ship's bow, vampires and humans alike shrinking back from his presence. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the faint amusement playing at the corners of his mouth. "You commanded me to stop," he said quietly, voice pitched for her ears alone. "Interesting." "He was going to kill that man," Lena said, hating how her voice shook. "Yes." Marcellus tilted his head slightly. "That was rather the point of a duel." "A duel requires willing participants." "It does." He gestured toward the human still kneeling on the ground, blood dripping from his face onto the stones. Thomas volunteered. He challenged Sir Gregor to combat after being caught stealing from the armoury. His eyes returned to hers, cold and measuring. "The penalty for theft is death. He chose to fight for his life rather than face execution, honourable if foolish." Lena looked past him at the young man, barely older than 20, terror written across his features. "And if he wins?" "He won't. But if he does," Marcellus's smile widened slightly. Then he lives. And Sir Gregor faces shame for losing to a human. He leaned closer, voice dropping to a whisper. Did you think us savages, Miss Bennett? We have laws, structure, even justice, though not the kind your priests preach about. Your justice is death. Sometimes, he straightened, turning to address the crowd. The duel is postponed. Thomas will be confined to the lower cells until I decide his fate. His gaze swept across the assembled vampires and humans, authority radiating from him like heat from a forge. Return to your duties. The crowd dispersed immediately, silent and efficient. Guards hauled Thomas to his feet and dragged him away, the young man's eyes finding Lena's for just a moment, gratitude and confusion warring in his expression. Sir Gregor, the vampire warrior, bowed stiffly to Marcellus and departed without a word, though his jaw was tight with barely suppressed anger. When they were alone, except for Lady Isolde hovering at a discreet distance, Marcellus turned back to Lena. "Walk with me." It wasn't a request. He started toward the eastern gardens without waiting for her response, clearly expecting her to follow. Lena hesitated, then cursed under her breath and hurried after him. The gardens were beautiful in a haunting, unnatural way. Everything grew too perfectly, roses blooming in colours that shouldn't exist, vines climbing stone walls in geometric patterns, fountains running with water that gleamed like mercury in the grey light. The air smelled of night-blooming jasmine and something underneath it, something cold and old that made her skin prickle. "Why did you stop the duel?" she asked when the silence became unbearable. "Because you asked me to." "That's not an answer." He stopped beside a fountain carved in the shape of a serpent eating its own tail, water flowing from its mouth in an endless loop. "You disrupted my court, interfered with legal proceedings, gave commands to a king in front of his subjects." He turned to face her, and for the first time she saw something other than cold amusement in his eyes, curiosity, sharp and dangerous. Any other human would have been executed immediately for such insolence. "Then why wasn't I?" "Because I want to see what you'll do next." He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the unnatural cold radiating from his skin. "You fascinate me, Lena Bennett. You stand in my hall and refuse to kneel. You reject my hospitality. You scream commands at me like you have any right to be heard." His hand rose, fingers brushing her cheek with a gentleness that somehow felt more threatening than violence. "Most humans learn submission within hours, but you," she jerked away from his touch, "I will never submit to you." His smile was slow and predatory and utterly without mercy. "We'll see." 3 days passed in a twilight existence that felt like drowning slowly. Lena was given more freedom than she'd expected, allowed to wander the castle's permitted areas under the watchful eyes of guards who followed at a distance. She explored the library, a vast chamber filled with books in languages she couldn't read, maps of territories that no longer existed, medical texts centuries old that she devoured with desperate focus. Anything to keep her mind occupied. Anything to stop thinking about the way Marcellus looked at her like she was a puzzle he intended to solve. He summoned her to dinner each evening. She went because refusing meant being dragged, and she'd learned to pick her battles. They sat across from each other at that long black table, and he asked her questions, casual things that felt like interrogations. What did she study with Master Aldrich? What remedies did she know? How did she diagnose fever versus infection? She answered with the minimum required, watching him watch her, trying to understand what game he was playing. On the 4th night, everything changed. She was in the library when the screaming started, distant at first, then closer, echoing through stone corridors with a desperation that made her blood run cold. Lena abandoned her book and ran toward the sound, ignoring the guards shouting behind her. She followed the noise to a chamber in the west wing where a crowd had gathered outside a closed door. Through the gap in the bodies she saw Lady Isolde, her usually composed face tight with something that looked like fear. "What's happening?" Lena pushed through the crowd. "Stay back," Isolde ordered, but her voice lacked its usual authority. Another scream tore through the air, and Lena recognized it this time. Male, young, agony turning human vocal cords into animal sounds. She shoved past Isolde and burst through the door before anyone could stop her. The room was chaos. A young man lay on a blood-soaked table, his armor removed, his chest torn open by something with claws. 3 vampires stood around him, one attempting to stitch the wound closed while the others held him down. But the injury was too deep, too ragged, and even Lena could see he was dying. "You're doing it wrong," she said. All 3 vampires turned to stare at her. One of them, a woman with silver hair and eyes like ice, bared her fangs. The human speaks out of turn. "The human knows medicine," Lena shot back, moving to the table. Up close, the wounded man was barely conscious, his skin grey, his breathing shallow. "You're trying to close the wound, but you haven't stopped the bleeding underneath. He's drowning in his own blood." "We are not physicians," the silver-haired vampire hissed. "We are soldiers." "Then let me work." "You have no authority here." "But I do." Marcellus's voice cut through the room like a blade. He stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Let her try." The vampires stepped back immediately. Lena didn't waste time questioning it. She moved to the wounded man, her hands already assessing the damage. The wound was deep, claws had punctured the lung, possibly nicked the heart. She'd seen injuries like this before in Master Aldrich's care, knew that stitching alone wouldn't save him. "I need clean water, needle and thread, strips of linen, and something to pack the wound," she said, her voice steady now, slipping into the familiar rhythm of crisis. "And I need him held completely still." The vampires moved with inhuman speed, bringing what she requested. Lena worked quickly, her training taking over. She cleaned the wound, packed it with linen soaked in wine to prevent infection, then began the painstaking process of stitching layer by layer, closing the internal damage before addressing the external. Her hands were steady, even as her heart raced. The man, Arik she heard someone call him, had stopped screaming, slipping into unconsciousness that was either mercy or death approaching. Time became meaningless. There was only the needle, the thread, the desperate rhythm of keeping someone alive. When she finally stepped back, her hands covered in blood, Arik's breathing had steadied, still shallow, still weak, but steady. The room was silent. Marcellus stood in the corner watching her with an expression she couldn't name. "He'll live," Lena said quietly. They took her back to her chamber, but the guard's demeanour had changed. No longer the cold indifference of jailers, but something closer to wariness. Respect, perhaps, or fear. Lena was too exhausted to care. She scrubbed Arik's blood from her hands in the silver basin, watching the water turn pink, then red, then clear again, as she poured fresh water and repeated the process. Her hands were shaking now that the crisis had passed, adrenaline draining away and leaving only bone-deep fatigue. She'd saved him, a vampire soldier who would have died without her intervention. The irony wasn't lost on her. A knock came at the door near midnight. Lena didn't bother answering. The door opened anyway, and Marcellus stepped inside, alone this time, no guards flanking him. He closed the door behind him with a soft click that sounded unnaturally loud in the silence. "You should be resting," he said. "I don't take orders from you." The response was automatic, hollow. She was too tired to put real defiance behind it. He crossed the room to where she sat by the window, moonlight painting everything in shades of silver and shadow. When he spoke again, his voice was different, stripped of the casual cruelty he usually wore like armour. "Arik Stone has served my court for 15 years. He saved my life twice, and tonight you gave me the chance to repay that debt. I didn't do it for you. I know." He was quiet for a moment, studying her profile. "You did it because that's who you are. You see suffering and you cannot walk away." He moved, closer, not touching her, but near enough that she could feel the cold radiating from him. "Do you know what your blood did when it touched his wound?" Lena's head snapped toward him. "What?" "One drop fell on the exposed tissue while you were working. I watched it happen." His eyes held hers, intense and searching. The flesh began to heal, not quickly, but faster than natural, faster than vampire regeneration. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and lifted her hand. Her palm was smeared with dried blood, some hers from where she'd gripped the needle too tightly. "This is what I meant about magic, Lena. Your blood doesn't just sustain, it heals, it restores." She pulled her hand back. "That's impossible. You just witnessed it yourself. I saw medicine work, training, not magic. Believe what you need to believe." He straightened, putting distance between them again. "But understand this. What you did tonight has changed everything. By tomorrow morning, every vampire in this court will know that the human girl healed Arik Stone. They will know your value. And that's supposed to comfort me?" Lena stood, anger flooding back now, hot and sharp. "That I'm even more valuable as a prisoner? That you have even more reason to keep me locked in this tower?" "It means," Marcellus said carefully, "that you have power here now. Real power, not the kind that comes from a throne or a crown, but the kind that comes from being needed." He moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the handle. "Arik will want to thank you when he wakes, and others will come seeking your skills. You can refuse them if you wish. I won't force you to heal anyone." "How generous." "It is, actually." He turned back to face her fully. "I could command you to bleed for every wounded soldier, every sick servant, could drain you dry and keep you barely alive to harvest what I need." His expression was serious now, no trace of mockery. "But I won't, because force breaks what I'm trying to build." "And what exactly are you trying to build?" His smile returned, small and dangerous. "That depends entirely on you, Miss Bennett." He left before she could respond, the door closing behind him with a finality that felt like a promise and a threat wrapped together. Lena stood alone in the moonlight, her blood-stained hands clenched at her sides, and realized with creeping horror that something had shifted between them tonight. She was no longer just his prisoner. She was becoming something far more dangerous, his necessity. Arik Stone woke on the 3rd day. Lena was in the library when Lady Isolde found her, the Chamberlain's expression carefully neutral as she delivered the message that the soldier was asking for her. Lena closed the medical text she'd been studying and followed without argument, curious despite herself. She'd checked on him twice in the days since the surgery, monitoring his breathing and changing the dressings while he remained unconscious. The vampires who guarded his recovery room had watched her work with silent intensity that made her skin crawl. He was sitting up when she entered, still pale but alive, the massive bandage across his chest stark white against his skin. His eyes found hers immediately, and something like reverence crossed his face. "You saved my life," he said. His voice was rough from disuse but steady. "I did my job," Lena replied, moving to his bedside to check the wound. She unwrapped the bandage carefully, examining the stitches. The flesh was healing cleanly, no signs of infection, the edges already beginning to knit together in a way that would have taken weeks in a human. "How does it feel?" "Like I was mauled by a lycanthrope and lived to regret it." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "But I'm alive. That's more than I expected." "What attacked you?" "Scouts from the Crimson faction." His expression darkened. "Prince Cassian's forces have been testing our borders for weeks. 3 of them ambushed our patrol 2 nights ago. We killed 2, but the 3rd got me before reinforcements arrived." He watched her work with curious eyes. "The others said your blood touched my wound, that it helped me heal." Lena's hands stilled. "Marcellus told you that?" "Everyone's talking about it." Arik shifted slightly, wincing. "The human girl with magic in her veins who saved the king's most loyal soldier. You're either blessed or cursed, Miss Bennett. Possibly both." "I'm neither. I'm just a physician's apprentice who knows how to stitch a wound." "With respect," Arik said quietly. "You're more than that now, whether you want to be or not." Before Lena could respond, the door opened and Marcellus entered with 2 other vampires she didn't recognize. One was tall and thin with ink-black hair and eyes like winter frost. The other was shorter, broader, with a cruel mouth and fingers that drummed restlessly against his thigh. Both wore the formal attire of court officials, dark velvets and silver chains of office. "Arik," Marcellus said with genuine warmth, "good to see you conscious." "Your Majesty?" Arik attempted to bow and grimaced. Marcellus waved him back down. "Rest! You've earned it." The king's gaze shifted to Lena. "Miss Bennett, allow me to introduce Lord Thaddeus Crane, my military advisor." He gestured to the tall vampire. "And Jasper Kane, treasurer of the Midnight Court." The shorter vampire's smile didn't reach his eyes. "A pleasure," Jasper said, his voice smooth as oil. "We've heard remarkable things about your talents." Something about him made Lena's instincts scream warning. She'd met men like this before, the kind who smiled while calculating how to use you. "I'm just doing what I was trained to do." "Modesty," Jasper purred. "How refreshing." He moved closer, circling her like a merchant appraising merchandise. "Tell me, Miss Bennett, what would you say your services are worth? Hypothetically, of course." "My services aren't for sale." "Everything is for sale," Jasper countered. "It's simply a matter of finding the right price." "Enough!" Marcellus's voice cut through the room like a blade. "Miss Bennett is under my protection. Her skills will be utilized as I see fit, not bartered like common goods." His eyes locked on Jasper with barely concealed warning. "Am I understood?" "Of course, Your Majesty," Jasper bowed, but the smile lingered. "I meant no offense. Simply curious about our newest asset." "Asset!" The word made Lena's stomach turn, and from the way Marcellus's jaw tightened, he'd caught it too. The attack came at dawn, when the sky was still bruised purple, and the castle's defences were at their weakest. Lena woke to the sound of bells clanging violent and urgent, followed by shouting and the distinctive clash of steel on steel echoing through the stone corridors. She threw off the blankets and ran to the window, pressing her face against the iron bars. Below in the courtyard, chaos had erupted. Armoured figures swarmed through a breached section of the outer wall, moving with inhuman speed, fangs bared and weapons gleaming red in the torchlight. The Crimson faction. It had to be. Her door burst open and Lady Isolde appeared, face grim, a sword in her hand that looked like it had tasted blood recently. "Come with me, now." "What's happening?" "Prince Cassian launched a siege." Isolde grabbed Lena's arm and pulled her into the corridor where other servants were being herded toward the inner keep. He brought 200 soldiers. They breached the east gate 10 minutes ago. Where's Marcellus? Fighting? Isolde's grip tightened. Which is why I need to get you somewhere safe before he tears this castle apart, looking for you. They descended the spiral staircase, joining a stream of humans and lesser vampires fleeing toward the reinforced chambers deep in the castle's heart. But halfway down, a section of the wall exploded inward in a shower of stone and mortar. 3 crimson soldiers poured through the gap, eyes wild with bloodlust, and the corridor became a slaughterhouse. Isolde shoved Lena behind her and met the first attacker with her blade, moving with brutal efficiency, but there were too many. A second vampire lunged past her defences, claws extended toward Lena's throat. She stumbled backward, tripped over rubble, went down hard. The vampire loomed over her, fangs bared, and she threw up her hands in useless defence. The killing blow never came. Instead, the vampire's head separated from his shoulders in a spray of black blood. Marcellus stood behind the corpse, sword dripping, his face transformed into something inhuman and terrible. His eyes found Lena on the ground, and for a moment the rage in them was so absolute she thought he might kill her himself, just for being in danger. "Get her to the vault," he snarled at Isolde. "Now!" Then he was gone, a blur of violence carving through the enemy like death personified. Isolde hauled Lena to her feet, and they ran, slipping on blood-slicked stone, the sounds of battle following them into the depths. The vault was a massive chamber carved from solid rock, its door 3 feet of iron and ancient magic. Inside, perhaps 50 humans and a handful of younger vampires huddled in terrified silence. Isolde shoved Lena through the entrance and sealed it behind them. "We wait," the Chamberlain said. "Either the king wins or we die here." Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time became meaningless in the windowless dark, measured only by the distant sounds of fighting that grew closer, then farther, then closer again. Lena sat with her back against cold stone, watching the others. Some prayed, some wept. Some sat in numb silence, knowing their fate rested in the hands of monsters fighting monsters. Then the sounds stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the chaos. The vault door groaned open, every head turned. Marcellus stood in the entrance, covered in blood that wasn't his own, breathing hard despite not needing to breathe at all. His eyes swept the room until they found Lena. Something in his expression shifted, the inhuman rage bleeding away into something almost like relief. "It's over," he said. "Cassian's forces are routed. The castle is secure." A collective exhale of relief rippled through the chamber, but Marcellus didn't move. He stood there staring at Lena with an intensity that made her skin prickle, and when he finally spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I need to see you, now." It wasn't a request. Lena stood on shaking legs and crossed the chamber toward him, aware of every eye watching, every breath held. When she reached him, he grabbed her wrist and pulled her into the corridor, away from witnesses, until they were alone, in the blood-stained dark. "Are you hurt?" His hands moved over her, checking for injuries with a desperation that felt wrong, coming from him. "I'm fine. Isolde protected me." "If you had died..." He didn't finish the sentence, didn't need to. The raw emotion in his voice completed it, and Lena realized with creeping horror that somewhere between captivity and defiance, between saving Arik and surviving this siege, something impossible had happened. The Monster King had started to care whether she lived or died, and she wasn't sure if that made her more safe or more trapped than ever before. Marcellus didn't let go of her wrist. His grip was firm but not painful as he led her through corridors she'd never seen, past the guards who turned their faces away, up a spiral staircase to the castle's highest tower. The door at the top was carved with symbols that seemed to move in the torchlight, wards older than memory. He pushed it open and pulled her inside. His chambers, the forbidden space, all dark wood and ancient tapestries, a massive bed draped in black silk, windows overlooking the battlefield where bodies still lay cooling in the dawn light. He released her and moved to the centre of the room, his movements slower than usual, deliberate. She could see it now, the way he favoured his left side, the dark stains spreading across his ribs where armour had failed. "You're hurt," she said. "I'll heal." But his voice lacked conviction. "Let me see it." "Lena!" He turned to face her, and the expression in his eyes stopped her breath. Not the cold calculation she'd grown accustomed to, but something raw and desperate. "I didn't bring you here to play physician." "Then why?" "Because I need—" He stopped, started again. "I'm asking, not commanding, not demanding." His jaw tightened. "I'm asking if you'll let me feed. Your blood, it heals faster than anything I've known. And there are still enemies at the gate. The king of the Midnight Court asking permission. The absurdity of it should have been laughable. Instead it felt like the ground shifting beneath her feet. "And if I say no?" "Then I say no." He moved closer, each step measured. "I won't take what isn't freely given, not from you, not any more." Lena's pulse hammered in her throat. She should refuse, should use this leverage to demand her freedom, to bargain for Declan's safety, to escape this twisted place. But looking at him now, wounded and asking instead of taking, she found herself nodding before reason could intervene. "Yes," she whispered. Something blazed in his eyes, hunger and relief and something darker. He closed the distance between them, one hand rising to cup her face with unexpected gentleness. "This will hurt." "I know. And it will feel—" He paused, thumb brushing her cheekbone. "Intimate, more than you're prepared for. Stop trying to talk me out of it." His laugh was low and rough. Then he lowered his head to her throat, and she felt his breath, cold against her skin, before the sharp, sudden pain of fangs breaking flesh. She gasped, fingers clutching his shoulders for balance, and the pain transformed into something else entirely. Heat flooded through her veins, pleasure dark and intoxicating, her body responding in ways that made her dizzy. She felt him drinking, felt her blood leaving her body and entering his, felt the connection between them blazing to life like lightning seeking ground. When he finally pulled back, his eyes were glowing, his wounds already closing. But he didn't release her. His forehead rested against hers, breathing hard despite not needing air. 3 centuries, he murmured, voice wrecked. 3 centuries, and I've never felt anything like that. "Marcellus!" The door burst open. A guard stood there, face grim. "Your Majesty, the treasurer. He's fled the castle, and he's taken the war chest with him." They found the evidence in Jasper's chambers within the hour. Ledgers with falsified entries, correspondence sealed with Cassian's crimson wax, maps marking vulnerable sections of the castle walls. Lena stood in the treasurer's abandoned office surrounded by vampires who moved with lethal purpose, and she felt the pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. "He's been bleeding the war fund for months," she said, holding up a ledger. "Look at these entries. Payments to blacksmiths who don't exist, grain shipments that never arrived. He's been stealing and covering it with phantom expenses." Lord Thaddeus Crane took the book from her hands, his expression darkening as he scanned the pages. "This is treason." "It's worse than that." Lena moved to the desk, where letters lay scattered. "He's been feeding information to Cassian. Troop movements, supply routes, the location of the Eastern Gate's weak point. She looked at Marcellus, who stood silent and still in the doorway, rage radiating from him like heat. Today's attack succeeded because Jasper told them exactly where to strike. "Find him," Marcellus said quietly. The two words carried enough violence to make seasoned warriors flinch. "Bring him back alive. I want the court to witness his judgment." Guards scattered immediately. Marcellus crossed to where Lena stood, his hand finding the small of her back in a gesture that felt protective and possessive in equal measure. "You see patterns," he said, "connections others miss." "I was trained to diagnose," she met his gaze. "Bodies, accounts, conspiracies, it's all the same principle. Find what doesn't fit." They caught Jasper 3 hours later trying to cross the western border. He was dragged into the throne room in chains, his expensive clothes torn and muddied, his composure finally shattered. The entire court assembled to witness, vampires and humans alike crowding the hall in tense silence. Marcellus sat on his throne, Lena standing beside it at his request. The placement wasn't lost on anyone, not a prisoner anymore, not a servant, something else entirely. "Jasper Kane," Marcellus began, voice carrying through the chamber, "you stand accused of embezzlement, treason, and conspiracy with enemy forces. How do you answer?" "She's lying!" Jasper's eyes found Lena, wild with desperation. "The human girl, she fabricated evidence to—" "I have your letters," Lena stepped forward, holding up the correspondence. "Written in your hand, sealed with your ring." She turned to address the court, her voice steady and clear. "Lord Kane has stolen over 50,000 in gold. He provided Prince Cassian with intelligence that resulted in today's attack. 17 vampires died because of his betrayal." The court erupted in fury. Vampires surged forward, only held back by Marcellus raising one hand. "The evidence is clear," the king said. "The sentence is death." He looked at Lena then, something like pride in his eyes. "But first the traitor will tell us everything, including when Cassian plans his next attack." Jasper's face drained of what little colour remained. 3 days, he whispered. "He's bringing his entire army, 500 strong." The throne room went deathly silent. "Then we have 3 days to prepare," Marcellus said. He stood, his hand extended toward Lena. "And this time, we'll be ready." The army came at dusk 3 days later, 500 vampires bearing Cassian's crimson banner, a tide of immortal fury crashing against the castle walls. Lena watched from the battlements as the siege began, catapults launching fire into the courtyard, battering rams slamming against reinforced gates. Marcellus had tried to send her to the vault again, but she'd refused, and something in her eyes had made him relent. "Stay behind the lines," he'd said, armoured and armed, looking every inch the warrior king. "Please." Now she moved through the makeshift hospital in the great hall, her hands steady as she stitched wounds and set broken bones. Her blood collected in vials that she distributed to the critically injured. One drop on exposed tissue and the healing accelerated, soldiers returning to the fight who should have been dying. Word spread through the defenders like wildfire. The human girl's blood was salvation. The battle raged for hours. Then the cry went up from the eastern wall, desperate and terrified. "The king is down!" Lena ran before conscious thought could stop her, pushing through armoured bodies and smoke, climbing stone stairs slick with blood until she reached the wall where Marcellus had fallen. He lay on his back, a crossbow bolt buried in his chest, the wood black and smouldering. Poisoned. The same toxin designed to kill ancients. "No." She dropped to her knees beside him, hands hovering over the wound. His skin was already grey, veins darkening beneath the surface. No, you don't get to die, not now. Lena! His voice was faint. Run! Shut up! She yanked the bolt free, and he convulsed, black blood pouring from the wound. Without hesitation, she drew the knife from her belt and sliced open her palm, pressing it directly against the injury. Her blood flowed into him, bright red against the poisoned black, and she felt the magic ignite between them, the same connection from the feeding, but amplified, desperate, blazing. The poison fought back. She poured more blood into the wound, her vision swimming, her heartbeat slowing. Around them the battle continued, but she heard none of it, focused only on the life beneath her hands, willing him to survive, commanding it the same way she'd commanded him to stop that first duel. Live, she whispered, that's an order. His eyes snapped open, glowing like stars. The grey receded from his skin, the wound began to close, and when he surged to his feet, her blood still on his lips, he moved like death incarnate. The soldiers around him rallied, energized by his resurrection, and the tide turned. Marcellus cut through enemy ranks like a blade through silk, and when he reached Prince Cassian at the heart of the attacking force, their duel lasted less than a minute. Cassian's head rolled across blood-stained stone, and his army broke, scattering into the night like shadows before. Dawn, victory. But Lena barely registered it. She sat against the wall, dizzy from blood loss, watching Marcellus stride back to her through the carnage. He knelt before her, took her bleeding hand in both of his, and kissed her palm with a reverence that stole her breath. I offer you a choice, he said quietly. Your freedom earned 100 times over, or a crown. Lena looked at the hand holding hers, still stained with her blood and his. Looked at the battlefield littered with bodies that would have included his if she hadn't intervened. Looked at the castle rising behind him, dark and ancient, and somehow impossibly home. I have conditions, she said. His smile was immediate, fierce with pride. Of course you do. Declan comes here, full protection, full education, full life. Her voice steadied. The human servants get representation on your council. Real voices, not tokens. She met his glowing eyes. And I sit beside you, not behind you, equal in every way that matters. Done. No hesitation. Anything else? Your heart. She squeezed his hand. All of it. No more walls, no more centuries of ice. You already have it. He pulled her to her feet, steadying her when she swayed. You've had it since the moment you refused to kneel. Then yes. The words came easier than breathing. I choose the crown. 3 weeks later, Lena stood in the throne room wearing a gown of midnight silk and crimson velvet, her brother safe in the front row beside Master Aldrich, both of them watching with tears streaming down their faces. The wound on her palm had healed to a thin silver scar, a reminder of the night she'd commanded a king to live and he'd obeyed. The entire court assembled in silence as Marcellus lifted the crown, silver wrought with obsidian roses, ancient and beautiful and forged specifically for her. He placed it on her head with hands that had killed thousands, but touched her with absolute reverence. Queen consort of the midnight court, he proclaimed, his voice carrying through the vast hall to every corner, every shadow. My equal, my salvation, my heart. The court knelt as one, vampires who had lived centuries, humans who had served in fear, all bowing before the girl who had arrived in chains and risen through sheer defiant will. Lena sat on the throne beside the monster king, her hand in his, and looked out at the kingdom she would help rebuild, the laws she would help rewrite, the future she would help forge. She had entered this castle as payment for a debt she didn't owe. She sat on this throne as a queen who had earned her crown in blood and courage, and the vampire king, who had claimed to own her, had become the one thing she never expected him to be, hers.